Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Open Window by the band Plus 33.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So sometimes on this series I find myself in situations in which the only presumable way in which I can listen to an album is by buying it somewhere online, or worse than that, buying a physical copy. But with smart navigation there's always a way to find an album for free. Whether it be finding an album on a sketchy Russian website, creating 10 separate accounts on multiple sites and downloading an album bit by bit, streaming an album entirely on its internet Bandcamp page, or just simply pirating off the Pirate Bay. I have yet to ever pay for an album that I listen to on this series, but today is different because today's album is the first ever album that I actually had to buy in order to listen to, and you know what that means. Patreon plug! Purchasing this album was made possible due to my lovely supporters over on Patreon, whose names you probably don't even know because let's face it, who the hell watches the video until the end? So if you'd like to help me buy the next unpiratable album on the list, you might want to check out the Patreon and consider supporting me there. Anyway, the links is in the description and in the channel's about page. Now let's move on to some of my favorite bits from this album. So today's album was particularly hard to find for free because there's only one place on the entire web in which it is being streamed, and that's on the band's official Bandcamp page, and of course there it is being sold to anyone who'd want to buy it. Now from the scarcity of this album online, you might as well infer that today's album is a highly obscure pick. And honestly, unless you are the creator of this album, I highly doubt that anyone watching this video right now have ever heard of the band Plus 33 or heard this album, and that's because this album was recommended to me by one of the family relatives of the lead member of the band Plus 33, Didier Grilot. So Didier Grilot is the mastermind behind this album, and everything that this album aims to explore and feature on it is a part of his own composition and writing. Now of course he didn't do everything by himself, and the performance was made with the rest of the band Plus 33, and together they performed this album. Now one thing I should note, and it isn't that critical for this album as a whole, but this one was recorded in a live setting, not a live show, just a live setting, as opposed to the common method of recording in which tracks and instruments are recorded separately and then put together in the mixing. Now this album is somewhat of a concept album. Now Grilot himself said that this album is sort of a concept album, but the concept is to be interpreted by the individual listener. Nevertheless, this album technically only has 5 songs on it, being of course Earth, Water, Fire, and Air, and an epilogue at the end. Of course, the 4 elements before that represent the basic 4 elements in which many cultures in the past believed to be the elements that the world was built from. And while making a concept album that revolves around the idea of the 4 basic elements sound like something unoriginal, I will have to admit that I've never seen an album do this before, and despite it sounding like a tried and tested method of doing a concept album, this is definitely not something that I've encountered in the past. Now technically, as I said, this album has 5 tracks on it, but each of the elements is definitely divided into subsections, and these subsections aren't just aesthetical, but they do serve a good purpose because the overall elements and the songs that represent them don't really aim to do the seamless transitions between one subsection to another, but each and every subsection is held as its own separate piece. Now normally when you hear this, and many of you that probably haven't listened to this album before, you'd expect that each of the elements would have its own personality, which is portrayed with the music being played in its part. And while that is somewhat true for this album, I do find that most of the music on here is kind of repetitive and doesn't really aim to change that much when switching between elements. And that's kind of an odd choice, and you can definitely see this with the first two elements being earth and water. Earth and water, despite being very different as an elemental basis type of thing, they really sound the same when it comes to the music, and I really don't get this decision. Moreover, the fact that fire and air seem to change things up a bit in order to match their identity, yet water and earth were very much just similar. And at first my thought was that because there is like a limited amount of instruments and actual players on here, maybe they couldn't have done more diversity for each and every one of the elements, but then I was proven wrong, because this not only has all of your typical rock instruments like a bass, keyboards, drums, and a guitar, this also has a saxophone, a flute, and a variety of different keyboards being played by Grillet himself. Oh, and by this point I should probably mention that this is an instrumental album, and this was an intentional decision done by Grillet so as to let the listener interpret the album however they wish to do so. And after going through this entire album and listening to each one of the elements, there is an epilogue. Now the epilogue to me seemed like it would be something to recap this entire album, to feature some sort of the elements, maybe even touch upon the aether element, which is also something, you know, highly interesting that I'm not gonna get into, but it doesn't seem to do any of that. It just feels like a piano improvisation for 5.5 minutes, and I really don't know what its purpose is. And as for the music to be found here as well, this is very much akin to the music of Pink Floyd, and specifically later Pink Floyd, and I even might say that it sounds a lot like what David Gilmour did in his early solo career. We have a lot of space rock on here, which is actually really well composed. There's a lot of good solos, a lot of good electric guitar solos and saxophone, and even there's a really good song on here that features entirely just a flute and a bunch of keys and guitar, and it's really good. That track is actually Deuce Verse, which is the second subsection of Earth, and it's a really good track, and I really enjoyed the flute soloing on here. But the thing that kind of bugged me was the sorta ASMR vibe that it had to it, because I could really hear the breathing of the person playing the flute, and I could hear the keys, you know, closing and opening with the fingers, and it kind of took my mind off from the music itself being played. Nevertheless, it still is my favorite from this album. So yeah, I might have dissed this album just a bit, but I want you all to know that this isn't a bad album, and as it comes for space rock as a whole, this is a pretty good album. It just doesn't really aim to do so many different things, and that's kind of a shame, seeing as it should, because it does have a concept with very much different elements to it that should be better represented in the music. And I'm saying should like it's something that's supposed to be a fact, but in actuality they could have done whatever they wanted, and I would have to appreciate it because that's their own decision. But unfortunately, as nice of an experience this was, this is a highly forgettable album, and this is probably how it will remain for the time being for me. But now let's talk about the cover, because this is definitely a neat one. So on its surface, there's really not a lot to see here. We have a nice illustration, and we also have the text of the name of the album and the name of the band. Now, while I don't think that the specific font that they used for the text is the best in the world, it overall looks fine. But my personal grudge with this album cover is actually the fact that they even used text in the first place, because the illustration on here just has everything that this album needed. We have a lovely illustration to feature each and every one of the elements in its own unique kind, and when they come all together, they form this, circle that is one thing that builds our entire world. So of course at the bottom you've got Earth. With its rugged edges, it lays as the basis for the entirety of the Earth. Then on top of it you have the element of water, the one that fills most of the Earth's surface, and it just flows in a very lovely manner. And much like Avatar: The Last Airbender taught us, we have the opposite element for water, and that's fire. With its sharp edges and very vibrant colors, it is both the element of life and the element of danger. And lastly you have air. air. Air is the invisible element that allows everything living to keep on living, and it's just lovely, and each and every one of them is represented just beautifully, and that's why I really hate the fact that they needed to slap on the tiles on it, because this cover without anything else could have been simply perfect. Nevertheless, this cover was able to intrigue me enough, so when I saw it for the first time a while ago, I actually decided to keep it on the list instead of removing it, because it was of course recommended to me by a biased person who already knew the band's music and wanted to promote it, but instead of removing it, I kept it on, and a lot of it is due to the cover. So this album, it's pretty fine, and it's gonna get a very solid, flowing, flaming, and windy 7 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to another highly obscure album tomorrow. We've been on a streak for 2 days now with very highly obscure albums, and that album of course will be Excuses for Kings by the band The Catch. I of course want to thank again to my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to K1 and Rest of Kings and Lindsay. Hey Cox, you guys are the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.